Welcome to the Operational Technology Cybersecurity Podcast. This podcast focuses on the rapidly growing and often misunderstood intersection of information technology and industrial process. What's going on, everybody? Derek here, episode 3. So I know for the OT cybersecurity faithful, it's been a minute since the last episode dropped, and I wish I could say this episode 3 is coming to you under better conditions. But today is March 13th, 2020, and the last few weeks have been a special kind of crazy. And not only on the macro level with Corona crazy and locusts taking over the world, but there has been a particular American horror story playing out in the U.S. domestic upstream oil and gas world. So quick warning from the top, if you don't care about oil and gas, feel free to skip this episode, because this one is going to be a deep dive into the current supply-demand mayhem, the price, the industry response, and ultimately how these high-pressure variables are important to cybersecurity. So with that said, let's crack this can of worms open. So full disclosure, I wasn't planning on dropping an episode today. And the trigger was a meetup I had on Wednesday with an industry friend who was just laid off on Monday. Let's call this friend Jim. Jim was laid off without warning from one of the mid-major E&P companies here in the Houston area. E&P stands for exploration and production, which broadly describes the upstream sector of the oil and gas industry. So Jim works in a team of 10 people. Himself and 7 others were laid off at 8 a.m. on Monday morning. The 2 people his company wanted to keep were told not to come in that day to avoid any undue cross-contamination between the living and the damned. Now let's be clear. The layoffs here aren't the problem. And I know Jim would echo this sentiment. Business people understand business. They understand price constraints. They understand they were hired as a result of a certain set of business factors, and likewise can be let go as a result of a certain set of business factors. The problem here is everything around the layoffs. It's the HR tactics to protect the business and control the separation situation and emotions as a whole. It's the false messaging, it's the lack of clarity and top-down communications that occurred for months prior to this price drop, and the knee-jerk nature of it all once it happened. All this compounded by the context of an already high-anxiety market turn. To any oil and gas company struggling in this downturn, if you know what's coming, just be transparent and just treat your people with dignity and respect and set them up for success as they transition out of your company into whatever is next for them. And look, I'm saying this about an industry that I love. I've worked in oil and gas most of my life and truly believe it's a fantastic industry, not only to work in, but to be part of your life. I love oil and gas because of the technologies, the challenges, the unique business factors, the amazing accomplishments, and the benefits that cheap, abundant energy have on society and innovation. But most of all, I love oil and gas because of the people. This industry is nothing without its people. And how we treat people, specifically employees, contractors, and vendors, in these situations, in these downturns, is abysmal. It always has been. And this is my call out because this has to change. This is a people industry and it has to do better. It's not just a matter of ethics. Just letting the world burn is ultimately a self-defeating business strategy. Going back to the example of Jim one last time. Jim and most of his team are the types of human assets the oil and gas industry is always complaining they're not getting enough of. Jim was with his company for about 3 years, was just starting to really dig in and grasp how their oil and gas operations worked, what mattered to their markets, what mattered to their customers, what systems do, what dependencies they have, the technologies, the culture, and most importantly, was starting to absorb the tribal knowledge from the vets and lifers at his company that, frankly, is going to be lost as workforces turn over. And now Jim and his cohorts will likely never re-enter oil and gas. What's the dollar value of that loss? What's the dollar value of Jim and his axed coworkers telling their peers how oil and gas bulldozed them, after months of the organization speaking out the other side of its mouth saying, "We're growing, business is normal"? This is particularly triggering to me because of how closely these events mirrored the 2016 downturn. And I guess I'll start there because it annoys me to no end hearing about this price drop talked about as another downturn, when we know full well the last downturn wasn't a normal downturn, and this one certainly is not. What's going on right now is a paradigm that's unique to the U.S. shale producer, and it's the product of many years of overborrowing and overproducing. So just to explain a bit further, what has happened to the oil price over the last few days is an attempt to kill the U.S. domestic shale production, including both oil and gas. This is hard to explain without too much politics, but I'll try. Following the oil embargoes in the 70s, a ban was placed on U.S. exports of oil. This wasn't a particularly big deal because at the time, the U.S. didn't produce a lot of oil and gas, aka hydrocarbons. And there was also a very limited infrastructure to transport these products. Plus, per the terms of the export ban, the U.S. could still export refined products made from hydrocarbons. So, no biggie. This limited supply balanced with limited demand. Then came fracking, the technology that changed the U.S. domestic game and upticked the exploration and production of U.S. domestic hydrocarbons from geological formations called shale. The Permian Basin is a name that likely most of you have heard of, and it's an example of a big-ass shale formation. This uptick really exploded post-2015 when President Obama lifted the export ban. Now the U.S. could play on the global export market, which oil and gas is uniquely situated for as one of the few truly global commodities. Now, another aspect that makes the U.S. production unique is ownership. Individual landowners own the rights to the hydrocarbons under their ground, aka mineral rights. So exploration and production companies make an agreement with landowners to drill and extract the products under their land ownership. Unlike other countries, there isn't one central regulatory body dictating supply of production from the U.S. domestic companies. And it's generally accepted under this model that U.S. producers, just produced as much as possible without regard for the global supply and demand. Another unique associated characteristic of the majority of shale producers is debt, and this resonates with the produce as much as possible comment. The relatively low barrier of entry to U.S. shale, in oil and gas terms, some fuzzy math and access to cheap credit allowed entry of many small and mid-sized companies to the U.S. producer scene. Now, many of these companies are great companies and accomplish great things. I don't mean any of these statements as a dig. It's just a fact that many of these companies weren't solvent and operated off debt. And that debt life was sustainable at a 50 to 60 per barrel price. But shale quickly stops making sense sub $40 a barrel. The last thing you need to know is the story regarding transportation and refinement of U.S. shale oil and gas, i.e. the midstream and downstream segments of the oil and gas industry. The shale boom precipitated a lot of infrastructure projects, including a vast amount of new pipeline between major shale basins and the U.S. refining hotspots, i.e. Kansas, some of the Northeast, but mainly the Texas Gulf Coast. Not all oil and gas is created equal. And to make a long story short, the U.S. refinery infrastructure, which was built under huge expense, mostly in the 80s, is designed for the heavy sour crude which comes from places like Africa, the Middle East, and some parts of South America. The stuff that comes from the U.S. shale basins is rather generously classified as light sweet crude, which most of our refining capabilities aren't built for. So it's better for export to other countries and other markets. So with all that context in place, the recent price drop came as a result of two things: reduced global demand as a result of the coronavirus, plus a historical oversupply pressure from the U.S. shale producer. Pressure which caused other oil-producing nations to have to cut their production in compensation. Those other oil-producing nations know that hydrocarbons from shale is a highly processed product. So, like an expensive McDonald's chicken nugget, in the midst of the coronavirus demand shortage, these other nations decided they didn't want chicken nuggets anymore and made a strategic move to no longer compensate for the U.S. oversupply and thus allowed natural economics of high supply and low demand to unfold. And that's the price drop we've witnessed over the last week or so. So I'm going to pause here for just a second and make a quick show note. If the topic of oil and gas economics and common sense is of interest to you, specifically in the context of this price drop, U.S. shale production, and where the industry goes next, David Ransom Wood, in his show, The Hot Take of the Day, is without a doubt the best source of content on this subject. Quite honestly, it's more than content. David is quickly emerging as the voice of this downturn and how the industry is going to have to come to grips with the economics at play. It's a fantastic podcast that I can't recommend enough. So this really sucks, and it really pains me to see an industry that I love suffering, even if some of the suffering is self-induced. So for those who don't know, the 2016 downturn is more accurately the bursting of the bubble from $100 per barrel oil to the $30-40 price point. This price dropping in half sent shockwaves through the upstream exploration and production sector and saw many of the same mass layoff and knee-jerk corporate behavior. For me personally, this is when my role was eliminated from an E&P company that I had spent almost 2 decades with. It was a raw feeling as I was let go and thought about the 110% that I had given, the weeks and months spent offshore, the innovations, the complex problems we solved, the personal relationships that I had developed, everything that I thought had mattered from my own little personal window and worldview was reduced to a number on a spreadsheet. And in a day, the ladder that I had worked so hard to start climbing was kicked out from under me. My income stream was cut like a thread that didn't belong. My long-term incentives were reduced to zero, healthcare reduced to zero, and I was released into a job market that had no opportunity. So I would be lying to you as the listener and lying to myself if I didn't say there's a little PTSD going on between the events of 2016 and what's occurring today. Oil and gas, and especially upstream, has to outgrow these business practices. This is childish behavior fueled by fiscal irresponsibility and burns employees, contractors, and vendors. This industry is nothing without its people. And we're going to encounter a huge people problem if this behavior keeps up. Another fragment, collateral damage, if you will, is the projects. And let's focus on that for a minute because this downturn comes at an interesting time. We find ourselves in the industrial marketplace, and specifically for this conversation in the oil and gas industry, where most operational companies are still playing catch up from the decades plus of control systems and computer-based operational systems sitting static and isolated, security by obscurity, for a long time. And in this time, no money was spent towards cybersecurity or system architecture, or design, or continuous maintenance, i.e. all the things that we know need to take place for computer-based systems to be reliable and secure. The history is, for a long time, none of that occurred. So the progress we're making today is fresh, even on a conceptual level. The minds and attitudes of people who own those industrial control systems are just now starting to evolve to a point where spending money on cyber risk mitigation and continuous maintenance is even part of the picture. Only now are we having conversations cross-functionally with the right people and partners who can secure the ecosystem as a whole in a holistic way that is manageable, measurable, and balanced. We're only now getting to a place where digital systems are treated with even an inkling of the same stewardship and maturity as mechanical systems are. Correcting this legacy posture, or lack thereof, is present-day work in progress. So how much of that work, how much of those efforts are going to be stopped, are going to be shelved, are even going to inch their way backwards as part of this downturn? And how much of that is going to be part of the new risk landscape? And here's where I change my tune a little bit. I'm not just going to pile on to this is the industry's fault. So my thesis is that cyber has to adopt to become part of the efficiency story. We have to help fight the low price point because it's here to stay. Now look, I would be the first to say securing industrial control systems and the other operationally focused and production critical computer systems, i.e. the OT environment, is best accomplished as a multi-layered program that is risk-ranked and consequence-driven, reinforced by technology investments that align with a distinct OT governance program built around a strong understanding of the company's operating model, industry best practices and standards, frameworks, reporting requirements, and last but not least, board-level mandated strategic objectives. Deep breath, because at the same time, I would also argue that achieving best practice should not be the goal of the U.S. domestic EMP company at this price point. What is feasible is to drive a deeper convergence of IT and OT. And I know, to the OT purist, what I'm saying is borderline sacrilege. But this is our best synergy for effective centralized ownership and administration of core services like authentication, segmentation, event management and escalation, remote access, profiling, and support. Deep IT-OT convergence will better equip either internal IT services or a managed service partner to support a new and consolidated workforce to ensure access controls are aligned, appropriate, and supported by the right business use cases. Similarly, from an infrastructure perspective, OT cyber can help drive a denser, more virtualized stack, managing server resources, storage, and networking. Obviously, this can be accomplished in many different ways and will depend on existing investments of either individual pieces of equipment, pre-existing virtualized infrastructure, or ideally through a highly targeted platform like Nutanix that is convergence tested and cloud ready. And lastly, in my opinion, this new group, this highly converged IT-OT group, needs to be able to effectively communicate with the business, to resonate and respond to a culture that just needs communication that's simple, clear, and efficient. And look, I don't know what this actually looks like. Maybe the risk tolerance has to go up, which means the way business is done has to change. Either has to go more manual or more automated. I don't know. I don't know what the delta is between where we are today and this particular destination. I just know it's a market-driven need that will make the difference between asset owners just turning off the spigot to all industrial cyber projects and activities versus scaling down to only the necessities, like an armadillo rolling itself into a ball of armor when being attacked by a much larger predator. We, the ones who are responsible for industrial cybersecurity, need to help enable this and laser focus on what must be accomplished to get business done. It sucks. I wish it wasn't this way. I wish these compromises weren't on the table, but they are. It's pretty simple, actually. If you're going to continue to produce, you have to continue to provide good stewardship over the systems that are doing that production. And we need to be crystal clear about that. It's painful, but in these times, innovation can be found in ways it wouldn't be considered otherwise. So we have to be open to that possibility. My closing note is this. To a society that depends on oil and gas production, yes, even U.S. domestic shale production, the bad guys, whoever they are, whoever stands to benefit from disruption of energy in the U.S. market, and that is a broad cast of characters. These groups know we are weak right now, more than ever. The chaos, the turnover, the project cuts, the pressure, the uncertainty, it all makes us vulnerable, specifically to cyber exploitation. Those groups are waiting for the projects to stop, for the posture to weaken, for security controls to be lax so that the job can get done. We have to be smarter than this, and we can't throw the cybersecurity baby out with the bathwater. Unless there is a full stop to production, you cannot stop cyber investments and you can't get rid of your cyber skill sets. The people who know your business, who know your systems, and who know how things work. You can't do this on the cyber side, just like you can't do this on the mechanical side with your maintenance programs, your mechanical integrity programs, and your safety programs. Otherwise, you are opening the door to damage of reputation, environment, and the livelihood of your people. This isn't over. Definitely more to come on this topic. So in closing, this price drop is not simply another downturn. It's a reaction to the very short-term and temporary demand drop from the coronavirus, and more principally, the unique market supply forces of the U.S. shale producer. The industry response, however, where the oil and gas industry goes back to old habits, Katie barred the door to the executive suite and commenced mass layoffs. The ghost of the 2016 downturn lives on to self-defeating ends. And for the purpose of cybersecurity, shooting themselves in the foot towards a degraded state that the bad guys and nation states know to look for, know to exploit, which is a new and significant people and attitude-driven risk for industrial operations within the oil and gas sector. So I'm ending it here. Let all that sink in. Definitely more content to come. Thanks so much to anyone who listened to the end of this podcast. Until next time, this is Derek signing off.